Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll begin because I've asked somebody to ring a bell for me at 8:15, and hopefully by that time we'll be getting near the end, because I don't want to talk all night. But you're extremely welcome. I don't think I need to remind you of the journey we've made, but they're all very beautiful. Started with the medieval church and brief look at, followed that by Martin Luther, then John Calvin, and last time it was the Reformation in Scotland. And this time we're going to look at the Council of Trent. I remember one of you whom I won't embarrass made it clear to me right at the start that she had never heard of the Council of Trent, and some of you might be in the same position, so I want to read to you just a sentence from this book. It says, "Anyone with the slightest interest in the cultural and religious history of early modern Europe has heard of the Council of Trent." So, if you've never heard of it, then that's you told. The Council of Trent. That's Trent, that's where the crown is. Just a couple of pictures to start with. A very impressive building, although I've never actually been there. There are loads of paintings of the Council of Trent. That's the most common one. So just to give you some kind of image in your mind. What I always say to people when I give these talks is that I'm not an expert really in anything. What I do, you can do for yourselves. I just study the thing, read something about it, put it together, and then come and give it to you. And the same is true tonight. So I wanted to just make clear straight away what my sources are. The first is a book called The Reformation by Patrick Collinson. He studied history at Cambridge, then did his doctorate in London, and has taught in various universities all over the world. So he's one source for me. The next, these books I read in Spain in January when I was on holiday, and this one as well, The Counter-Reformation. This is edited, this book, so it's a various authors, but the particular chapter that I've relied on is this chapter by Hubert Jedin, or Jedin to German. His importance is that after the Council of Trent, the documents really were put in the Vatican Library, all the accounts of everything that happened, and they weren't available to scholars until about 1880, in the time of Pope Leo XIII. And Jedin is the man who did tremendous work. He died in the 1970s. He's German, published 3 volumes on the Council of Trent, and according to the people I've read, he is the authority on the Council of Trent. And it has a very important chapter in that book which I've drawn on quite a bit. The next one is the Council of Trent, what happened at the Council, and it's by William O'Malley, who's an extremely well-known Jesuit historian, an American. He's also written a book about the Second Vatican Council. He also wrote, or actually didn't write it, because this is an excellent book. If you want some enjoyable reading, this is terrific. If you're interested at all in church history. It's just a series of talks and lectures that he's given over the years, which his editors or his publishers have obviously just drawn together. Probably as a way of making money, but there are some tremendous articles in it. The other one is this book here, which is called Reformation, Dissent and Diversity. I didn't use anything in it, but I found it very instructive because it's about the Church of Scotland, basically, the church in Scotland. It has the cheek to mention the Catholic Church 3 times, I think, in the whole book, but it's the church in Scotland, and it really helped me to understand the answer to a question that Matt Smith asked the last time, which was why it was that the Catholic Church remained basically united and the Reformed Church is split into so many parts. And I had no idea just how many parts the Church in Scotland had split into. All kinds of, apart from the major divisions, there were a huge number That's between 1560 and 1960. A huge number of small churches came into existence. And the characteristic of them was that every single one of them thought they were right and everybody else was wrong. And then, of course, the internet. So there was, those are the sources. So if you have any quarrel with anything I say, you can refer you to these people. What I want to talk about tonight is 3 sections. The first is to look at these 2 questions. The first one is the first chapter of Collinson, and the Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation is the title of Hubert Jennings' article. One of the things that we've been hearing over the months, we're getting an impression that the church was just going along and then came along and then appeared Martin Luther and it all changed. I mean, nothing could be fuller to the truth than that, as we'll see. Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation, for a long time, people thought that the Council of Trent was a kind of response to the Protestant Reformation. But my understanding is that most historians today would say that's not really true. There's an element of that, but fundamentally the Catholic Reformation had a life entirely of its own, and wasn't just a response. The second thing we'll look at is the Council itself. And the third thing is the legacy of Trent. Ecclesia Semper Reformanda. Can any of you remember your Latin? It's a church in constant need of reform. And reform has been part of the life of the church for centuries. It's been there from the very beginning. In the 11th century, just to give a few examples of it, in the 11th century, the Gregorian reforms. Fundamentally, all these reforms were trying to do the same thing. They were trying to do something about the clergy and their behaviour. There were other things as well, but the corruption and so on. That and among other things was what the Gregorian reforms were aimed at in the 11th century with limited success. In the 12th century, we had, for example, the Waldensians who wanted a simpler church, who wanted more emphasis on the Bible, and those are themes that run right through. So Luther and Calvin didn't invent these things. In the 13th century, we had the Fourth Lateran Council, which was a tremendously reforming council. One of the things that it was really the first one that really tried to be firm on the whole question of celibacy for the clergy. The Mendicant orders in the 13th century, the Franciscans and the Dominicans in particular, these saw that something needed to happen. And they, especially the Franciscans, of course, founded by St. Francis of Assisi, adopted a very simple lifestyle and were very, very challenging to the church and to the Pope at the time, trying to bring about change, because there had been a tremendous gap had developed between the official church and the peasants down in their villages who had no proper instruction, and it was to try and do something about that the Mendicant orders came into existence. In the 14th century, you find the appearance of mysticism. This was a desire for a more personal faith. And in England, you had people like Julian of Norwich, and you had people in Germany, Hildegard of Bingen and Meister Eckhart and others. That was a very important movement. You also had Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, both of whom wanted to reform the church in the same basic ways. Hus, of course, was executed. Wycliffe, he died in his bed. Then, of course, we had the Great Schism, which we heard about a little bit in the first meeting. I don't want to say too much about it, but that arose at the time when we had eventually 3 different popes. Because of the power of the French, the popes had moved to Avignon. There were 7 popes lived in Avignon. And then Gregory, whatever his name was, one of the Gregory's 9th, I think, moved back to Rome. And when he died, Urban VI was elected, but then the French didn't like that, so another one was elected, so you had 2 popes. So how were they going to resolve this? So they elected a 3rd one, and now we have 3 popes. As Philip said the first night, 3 popes are better than 1. And that brought about a tremendous realisation that change was required. We'll come back to it in a minute. In the 15th century, we had many things, but the new devotion, the Devotio Moderna, one of the things which it produced was, which Catholics among us certainly will be aware of, was the imitation of Christ. It was a real invitation to deeper piety. Thomas à Kempis wrote that. As a child, I remember a thing I learned about Thomas à Kempis, whether it was true or not. He was never ordained, but never canonised. I never heard the story of why. Maybe this is not true, but this is my head. That when they exhumed his body, it was something out of Edgar Allan Poe. There was signs of scratching on the top of the coffin, so there was a part of his life they couldn't account for, but he might have despaired or something. So, and then of course there was William Tyndale who was English and translated the Bible into English and was also executed. Savonarola, very interesting character, reminds me a little bit of Calvin. Calvin had this idea that Geneva, remember, could be the city of God. Savonarola thought the same of Florence. He was a fanatical preacher, very, very puritanical, and he was very successful a while. The Medici had to clear out of Florence for a while because of the famous burning of what's it called, the burning of the vanities, where the people all gathered in the square and he burnt all their luxuries and so on. He made a lot of enemies, especially Alexander the Sixth, who of all the Borgia popes was probably the worst of all. And to make enemies of him was not a good idea. So Savonarola was eventually martyred as well, or killed, hung and then burnt till there was nothing left but ashes. Then there was Nicholas of Cusa. Now, I want to just quote, where is it? Is it in here? Nicholas of Cusa lived in the 15th century, as you see. Yeah, he was a kind of precursor of Erasmus. He was an academic, and he was a priest, a Catholic priest, of course, as all these people were, many of them. And just to leave it this, in about 1451, a German priest addressed the cardinal legate to his country, the scholar and statesman Nicholas of Cusa, himself a German. And this is what he said: "The cardinal legate has come to us in order to reform our nation. But how shall he succeed in this reform? If the head is sick, the limbs also feel the pain. If reform is to be accomplished, it must begin with the Pope and the Roman Curia. It is the Pope and the cardinals who daily commit the most fearful transgression and abuses." That was in the 15th century. He goes on to say, Luther was not the first German to criticise the papacy. So this movement for reform has been going on for a long time. The Council of Constance was the one that solved the problem with the three popes, and it raised a huge issue for the papacy. And it had a big influence on the delay to the Council of Trent, because you just have to think about it. There were three popes, who was going to call a council? They didn't recognise each other. The supporters didn't recognise each other. So the cardinals, a group of cardinals, called the council. And that gave rise to a notion called conciliarism, which somebody like Hans Kuhn still very much pushes today, which is that the council was superior to the Pope. It went so far as to suggest that the Pope's real job, a bit like the moderator at the General Assembly, was to implement the decisions of the council. Now this was a huge threat to the papacy's traditional power. And it was going on in the 15th century, long before Cardinal Luther. A special page for Erasmus. We've heard about Erasmus already. Erasmus was particularly important. He was a great Renaissance scholar. He was an Augustinian monk, like Luther, and a Catholic priest. He very much encouraged reform movements. He rejected both Luther and the excessive claims of the papacy. He was a man who could see all sides of an argument. And like everybody like that, the next verse says, he was denounced from both sides. Everybody attacked Erasmus. It's a bit like the BBC. You know? Everybody thinks the BBC is biased against them, which to me is always a sign that they've been fairly objective. And he was totally committed to the unity of the church. Although there was so much that Erasmus wanted to change, he remained a Catholic priest all his life. It's often said, this is one of the cliches about Erasmus, that Erasmus laid the eggs and Luther hatched them. That's one of the things they say about Erasmus. And he was a great defender of free choice against Calvinism. Well, of course, it was before Calvin, but he was a great defender of free choice, and we'll see more of that when we look again at the whole question of justification. Collinson says that Martin Luther was born into a world where the word reform was on everyone's lips. Does that make sense to you? Been at it for centuries. The paradox is that Luther's criticism came from deep within the very tradition he renounced. And that's obvious as well. And Luther himself, of course, did not start off with the intention of dividing the church. He started off with the intention of reforming it. And things got out of hand, and he wasn't happy with all the things that happened as a result of his own actions. He very much objected to being called a Lutheran because he didn't believe there was such a thing as Lutheranism. So back to our two questions. The Reformation, what Reformation? I hope you now understand that, because there was Reformation going on for centuries. And the Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation, again, most of the whole movement, in fact, for reform came from inside the pre-Reformation church, because there was nowhere else for it to come from. Collinson's another, I can just find it quickly, another little quote. Yeah, he says, "No revolution, however drastic, has ever involved a total repudiation of what came before it. What do revolutionaries have to work with but the ideas and aspirations that they had inherited? What was Stalin but the new kind of Tsar? Thomas Hobbes pronounced that the papacy is not other than the ghost of the deceased Roman Empire, sitting crowned upon the grave thereof. Jesus was not the first Christian, and Luther was not a Lutheran." So that's the first part of this evening. And I hope is that clear to you? Is there anything anybody wants to clarify at this point? It's clear enough, is it? Next question is, what was different this time? How did Luther survive? Because people before him, like Savonarola and Hus and others, like Tyndale, they had been executed. So why did Luther survive? Remember when he went to the diet of worms, he was a bit anxious that they might treat him the same way as they had treated us a century earlier. And it's important to understand why that did not happen. Harold Macmillan once said, "Events, dear boy." And it was all about events. In 1509, remember, 1517 was when Luther put his fetus up in the door. In 1509, Henry VIII had come to power. In 1515, Francis I of France came to power. In 1516, Charles I, who was the first Charles I of Spain, became King of Spain. And in 1519, as Charles V, he became the Holy Roman Emperor. And in 1520, Solomon the Magnificent came to power. And then in 1521, the Diet of Worms. So the Diet of Worms takes place against the background of these people. I just want to, I don't think I need to, that one up there. Henry VIII, Francis I, Charles V, there's another for you, Solomon the Magnificent, and of course Luther himself. Luther survived the Diet of Worms for a very simple reason. And that was that Charles V, who would have been the one who had the power to condemn him, couldn't afford to. And the reason he couldn't afford to was, some of you will be well aware of this, was that he was dealing with two enemies at the same time. One of them was Francis I. The French had constant struggles with Charles and Roman, Holy Roman Emperor, because he was stronger than they were. He was too strong for them. And on the east, there was the threat of Solomon the Magnificent in 1829, which is not that much later, and all through the 1520s. Solomon Magnificent was threatening Europe. The famous phrase, they went at the gates of Vienna, besieging Vienna, and they didn't actually succeed. But that had a huge influence on people's thinking in Europe. And I think that's worth thinking about in the light of our current situation. Because we're in the west of Europe. But the east of Europe still has in its collective unconscious fear of the Turks. That's why people in Austria, Hungary and places like that see the whole migration question very differently from we do. Just as the Arabs, if you use the word crusade, that conjures up a whole image for them from their history. The whole notion of immigrants, of Muslims pouring into Eastern Europe, that's very deep in the psyche of people up in that part of the world as well. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind. It's part of the current situation that we're facing. So, the point was, as the Night of Worms and Luther taking his stand and all the rest of it, Charles couldn't afford to get rid of Luther. Because the German princes they didn't all agree with Luther, but they realised that Luther was someone they could use against Charles. And Charles needed to keep the German princes on side, so that he wasn't dealing with them and the Turks at the same time, that they would be part of, if necessary, the struggle against the Turks. And so for that reason, events, dear boy, Luther survived. And you remember he went to the Castle of Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, and he was killed for a while there. But Frederick, to me, is a fascinating character because he tells us something about this whole period in history. Because he was a liberal who founded and supported a modern university. But he also had the biggest collection of relics in Europe. Enough relics to get thousands of people out of purgatory, as many as you want. And what really brings it together, remember how we saw how the inventing of printing was such an important part of this movement. He actually used the printing press to publish, what do you call it? Lost the word, happens to me all the time. Catalogue is a very word, thank you. To publish a catalogue of his relics. Now, isn't that a wonderful image? I mean, there's a split going on here that the tectonic plates of Europe are shifting, and this man's standing with one foot on one side and one on the other. He's supporting modern universities. He's using the printing press to publish a catalogue of his relics. I think that's a fantastic image to us of what was going on in Europe at this point. So, return towards the Council of Trent. From the Night of Worms onwards, Charles V wanted a council of the church. The reason he wanted a council of the church, and from the very start, Charles is the biggest proponent of the council. So it's not the church at this point that's pushing for a council, it's Charles V, and it's for political reasons. He wants to resolve all this conflict, because all this conflict going on in his territory is not at all suitable, attractive to him. And so he wants to re-establish order. And that's fundamentally where the desire for the Council of Trent comes from. There's a couple of words to Reichstag and Nuremberg, isn't there? 1522 to 1523, the Reichstag met in Europe, in Nuremberg, and they received a message from Pope Adrian VI, where he spoke about the sins of the clergy. This was another attempt to try and bring about healing of what was going on. And the Diet responded, and it demanded four things. First of all, exurge domine is not the last word. Exurge domine was the name of the document which excommunicated Luther. All papal documents are called by the first couple of Latin words in the original text, still today. It's because they're translated into so many languages, but Latin is still the language in which they all first appear. So that was the first thing that came from the Diet, the Reichstag. The second was that only a council could judge impartially. If there was going to be any healing of the rift, then only a council of the church could judge Luther impartially, because everybody else was too much on one side or the other. They also argued that it should be settled in Germany because it was a German problem. And you'll see in a moment how the place for the Council of Trent was going to take place was a constant thorn in the flesh of those who went to the council. So it should be settled in Germany, and also the reform of the church required a council. So again, everybody's wanting reform in the church. And the Reichstag responds to this message from Adrian VI by saying that a general council of the church is the only way in which this can happen. So they see two purposes in the council: to judge Luther objectively and fairly, and to reform the church. There were some local efforts at this, just to mention a couple. There was a provincial council of Lyon in 1527, there was a council of Bourges in 1528, and then this one here, which happened in Slong near Paris in 1528, was important, because this was the first time that anybody identified clearly what the big issue was. It's obvious to us what the big issue was, and we had plenty about it in the previous talks. But this council was the first one that identified that justification was the big issue. And it also produced a whole series of proposals, which turned out in the end really to be pretty close to what the Council of Trent eventually did. This Cayetan, he was the head of the Dominicans, and he sent a memo to Clement in 1528, where he suggested that people should be allowed to take from the cup of the chalice. He wanted priests in Germany to be allowed to marry. He wanted the liturgy celebrated, but he was suggesting that these things could happen. It wasn't accepted at that time, but this is an important person in the Catholic Church proposing these things. The cup, for example, over the centuries became a symbol of division. It was ludicrous. I mean, actually the Pope, after the Council of Trent, actually gave permission for the cup to be given at Mass in the German territories. And they did it for a little while, but then they stopped themselves because it was too much of Lutheranism. So that was never a serious issue. And there are many other examples of that. So we have a line-up for and against the council. For it is Charles V. Against it is Francis. And his reason is that politically this council would be of benefit to Charles V. And that's why he's against it, because he and Charles V have each other all the time. I mean, the fight umpteen battles over this period, I think Francis only won one of them and got battered and all the rest of them. And with Clement VII as the Pope, who dithered, and that's him dithering. There's one interesting dither, which I'll mention to you. This was the man who had to decide whether Henry VIII would get his annulment or not. Now, according to what I've read, Henry VIII actually had a very good case canonically. But Clement's problem was, and he spent his whole papacy with this problem, was who was he going to support? Was he going to support Francis and the French, or was he going to support Charles V? And they had a different opinion. Clement had allied himself with Henry VIII, so he was supporting Henry. But Charles V was supporting Catherine of Aragon. And you think why? Because she was his auntie. And so Clement had to decide what to do. do, and he fell on that occasion on the side of Charles V. But if he had fallen on the side of Francis I, perhaps the Reformation in England might never have happened. Or if it had happened, it would have been a very different event from what it actually became. And all that depended on this man dithering what side of the argument was he going to come down on. And of course, the whole history is full of stuff like that. What ifs and if onlys. And what would have happened if he had done that instead of doing that? I mean, the speculation is endless. Anyway, that was Clement VII. Conciliarism I mentioned earlier. This was one of the really big things that prevented the Council of Trent happening until a good number of years later, until the 1540s. I've already referred to the Avignon popes, Gregory the XIth that was returning to Rome, the Schism, and the Council of Constance. That was one of the big problems that Clement had. And so he kept putting people off. He would say to folk what they wanted to hear, and then he would do the same to somebody else. We probably know folk like that. But he would never make up his mind about it. Because fundamentally he was scared, as the whole Church of Rome was scared of what might happen if there was a council. It might rebel against the Pope. It might try to carry forward the vision that had happened at the Council of Constance. And so that was one of the main reasons why they didn't want to have a council. However, Pope Paul III, who came after Clement, he was in favour of reform. And part of it was that he was starting to panic. That the division between Rome and Lutheranism was getting wider and wider and wider. In 1527, I think it was, Rome was sacked. I mean, when I mean sacked, Charles V's troops came in and caused havoc in Rome over 3 days, destroyed a huge amount of stuff and killed off the whole Swiss Guard. Charles V wasn't there and hadn't approved of it, but what happened was that the Pope had made an alliance with the French. The Pope, you remember, wasn't living in the Vatican. He was the ruler of most of Italy. And they had made an alliance against Charles, and Charles had defeated them very severely. And after that happened, his troops lost discipline, and after they had taken Rome, and the results were terrible. So that there was panic about that, and as well as that, there was this continuing fear of the Turks. I mean, the Turks were always at that time, they were always attacking ships in the Mediterranean, attacking ports and plundering and disappearing again. It helps you to explain why, for example, the Spaniards, Spain expelled the Moors, because they were terrified that if the Turks invaded, that all these Moors who were also Muslims would be on the side of the Turks. And that's the way he imprisoned Italians and others during the Second World War, afraid that there was a fifth column. So the Turks are lying in the background all the time here. The threat finally disappeared temporarily in 1571. There was a famous battle. Did anybody know what the battle was? The Battle of Lepanto, led by Don John of Austria, of course, and Don Juan de Austria, who was the illegitimate son of Charles V and a half-brother of Philip II, who was the king of Spain. So that's Paul. I put that picture on the right. These are by Titian. I'm not entirely sure, but these two fellows are described as his nephews, I think. But they were probably his grandsons. During that period, the period of Borgias and all that, nephews was a euphemism for other things in many cases. But that's Paul III. There were three aims of these papacy. The first was to bring peace between the Christian princes, that was Charles and Francis. The second was to convoke a council of church, because he saw the need for it. And the third was to start another crusade, there's that word again, to push back the Turks. Paul was trying very hard. As a cardinal in 1512, he gave up his mistress and his 3 sons and 1 daughter. Now you might think that's just typical. But in actual fact, he wasn't ordained at that time. He was a cardinal, but he was a layman. But then he was ordained a priest. And he set about implementing the reforms of the Fifth Lateran Council. And then as Pope, in 1536, he set up a commission on reform of the church. And again, I want to read you something of this commission, something that said, this is a paragraph of it, talking about the evils in the church. The origin of these evils was due to the fact that some popes, your predecessors, this is a report that's been given to the Pope, engaged for themselves teachers, not that they might learn from them what they should do, but that they might find through the application and cleverness of these teachers a justification for what it pleased them to do. Teachers who taught that the Pope is Lord of all benefices, and that therefore, since a Lord may sell by right what is his own, it necessarily follows that the Pope cannot be guilty of simony. Simony, the selling of holy things, had been a problem right since the reforms of Gregory. It was one of the things he was trying to get rid of. Thus, the will of the Pope, of whatever kind it might be, is the rule governing his activities and deeds, whence it may be shown, without doubt, that whatever is pleasing to him is also permitted. From this source, as from a Trojan horse, so many abuses and such grave diseases are rushed upon the Church of God, that we now see her afflicted almost to the despair of salvation. So Paul asked for set up his commission to look at the situation, and that's what he told them. So it's hardly surprising that he was keen to have a council. But there was stiff opposition. First of all, because people realised that the situation had gone so far that there was no longer any point or any chance of reconciliation between the church and Luther. There were those who thought that it might happen, but there was a lot of doubt about it. Lutheranism had gone too far. Church property had been confiscated. That was a great attraction for lots of people, and especially the German princes. Once all this trouble started, they were in their little shop grabbing land and benefiting greatly from it, and there was a general recognition that there was no way they were going to give this back again. Also, the clergy were already married with families, and we've seen already how Cayetan wanted to just let them carry on doing this. But there was great scepticism about what council could achieve, which led to cynicism. But there were attempts at the council. In 1536, Paul tried to have suggested a council at Mantua. It didn't work. The great problem was still with diplomacy today. Where was this council going to meet? Charles, remember, was King of Spain as well as Holy Roman Emperor. It couldn't happen in Spain because the French wouldn't go to Spain. They couldn't have it in Italy because the Protestants wouldn't go to Italy. They couldn't have it in Germany because the French wouldn't go to Germany. It's typical of politicians in every age, isn't it? So that didn't work. In 1539, he proposed Vicenza, which was in Italy. It didn't work. This wasn't an attempt at the council, but it's a very important moment because after Vicenza, when it failed, there was a whole series of colloquies or conversations that went on between leaders of Lutheranism and the Vatican. And this very important one took place at Regensburg. And they actually, and I know maybe say why this was no great deal actually, but it seemed a great big deal at the time. They came to complete agreement on the doctrine of justification. But they disagreed over other things, about the number of the sacraments and various other things, and so it came to nothing. But even in 1541, there was agreement between Rome and the Lutherans about justification. It didn't become official until 1999, you remember, when there was a joint declaration. But in 1541, they had already agreed. So it wasn't such a big deal, really. A bit like the cup, you know, that's what happens in history. In 1543, it was a false start at Trent. Some poor people even turned up, but nothing happened. And that didn't help matters because when they went home, they were sick of no young men back there after all that carry on. Because you're walking halfway across Europe and there's wars going on everywhere. But in 1444, an event happened which led to the council actually starting. And that was in 1544, Charles beat Francis again. Was ready, which was the outskirts of Paris. And as part of the peace treaty, Charles forced Francis into accepting that there would be a council. And it started in 1545. That's when it eventually got off the ground. Just to show you what Trent is. It looks as if it's in Italy, and it is in Italy. But it was Holy Roman Empire territory at the time. So they settled for it. It was in Italy, but it was a long way from Rome. They would have been terrified to have it in Rome because the Pope would have too much influence over it. And it was kind of German territory. And that's why Trent was agreed upon. The council had two aims, Paul had anyway. One was to affirm the doctrine of the church, and the second was to reform the practice of the church. The phrase which had been used for centuries was head and limbs, I think. Head and limbs reform. Everything had to be reformed from top to bottom. Everybody could see that. And that was the aim of the council. There were 3 stages to it. It lasted 18 years, but most of that time nothing was happening. There was a period from 1545 to 1547 when there was practically nobody there. Folk didn't believe that this was actually going to happen. A handful of guys turned up and hung around for a while in Trent. There were some discussions, but not much happened during the first period. There was also a point too when they had to clear off to Bologna because the plague broke out in Trent. But anyway, then there was the middle years, 1551 to 1552. More people attended this time. It was starting to grow a bit, at least it was off the ground. And the final stage, when most of the work happened, was between 1562 and 1563. So there was only a short period of time when the council was actually in session. Give it a reminder. You asked the one me. You should put me on the strike.
I'm waiting against it.
Yeah, that's okay. In the end, the Pope was very keen at the end, as I explained to somebody this morning, that it finished because the cost of it was phenomenal. I read a statistic which said that the council by this time was costing the Vatican a bigger percentage of its income than the National Health Service is costing us today. And so the Pope says, look, this has got to stop. And it more or less was brought to an end. You know, there were documents which were passed and nobody had ever even read them. You know, and because they just more or less drew a line and had to stop. But those were the 3 stages of the council. Present at the council, this is very brief, there were bishops, theoretically from all over the world, but most of them were Italians. There were legates. Legates were the Pope's representatives who run the council, because the Pope never attended any of the sessions of the council. The envoys, they were the representatives of the civil leaders, Charles and all the rest of them. Although by the end Charles was dead. Charles eventually died in 1558. He resigned 2 years earlier, handed over the Holy Roman Empire to his brother and Philip II, who'd been ruling Spain for years anyway, became king, and Charles retired to a monastery to the west of Madrid in Extremadura called Yuste, and the man must have been sick of it. Can you imagine what it was like to be travelling around Europe fighting battles and, he had enough of it. And I was surprised. But anyway, they all had their envoys, and then of course there were the theologians as well. These are the key figures. First of all, Paul III. There were 3 popes, although there were other popes in between who weren't involved in the council. Then Julius III, and then Pius IV. If you look at those pictures, you can well come to the conclusion that when you've seen one pope, you've seen another. You'll notice the didn't dress in white and all that kind of stuff in those days. These were the key secular rulers. Charles V, and his brother Ferdinand, he handed over the Roman Empire to Francis I and his sons. Francis I and his son Henry II. And the woman here was important, Chief Catherine de Medici, because Henry II was killed in a jousting accident. The heirs to the throne were tiny, so she was the mother, and she ran the place for a long time, and she was an important figure. And down at the bottom, of course, is Philip II of Spain. Spain, of course, was in the height of its powers and had this massive empire. Philip II was actually the only secular leader who actually attended the Council of Trent, and he was very, very keen to implement it. The papal legates, very briefly. Giovanni Maria del Monte. These were the people that run the council on behalf of the Pope. Cernini, Reginald Pole, Giovanni Moroni, and Charles de Guise. The bishop kept calling them the Guise family, but they're the Guise family. And a couple of very interesting things. Reginald Pole, of course, was English, and apparently only lost the vote to the Pope to Maria del Monte, who became Julius III. Giovanni Moroni and Reginald Pole and Charles de Guise were all considered really by Rome at various times to be a bit dangerous, a bit liberal. And Moroni was actually imprisoned and taken out of prison to finish off the Council of Trent and get it completed. They were accused at various times of being too Lutheran. Affirmation of doctrine. This is, I'll definitely finish before half past. This is really important to read this, because there are 3 statements here which go to the heart of the matter theologically. This is what the Council of Trent says about justification. So hopefully you remember the things that we've been hearing at previous meetings. Councils always condemn statements. The Council of Trent was very careful not to condemn any individual. It never mentioned Luther or Calvin. It just condemned statements. And they all begin sequence dixerit, and then they all end up in anathema. If anyone says that, let them be cursed or condemned. So if anyone shall say that a man may be justified before God by his own works, whether done through the strength of human nature or through the teaching of the law, without the divine grace through Jesus Christ, anathema sit. That's what the church was often accused of, the opposite of that, of saying that people can be saved by their own efforts. The church has never believed that. It was condemned in the early centuries. Pelagianism, that's what it was called. And the Council of Trent makes it absolutely clear that if anyone says that, anathema sit. It then goes on to say, if anyone shall say that since Adam's sin, the free will of man is lost and extinguished, or that it is a thing with a name only, yea, a title without a reality, anathema sit. This is against predestination. Calvin's whole notion that it was always the way at the beginning of time, there's not anything you can do about it. You're either saved or you're not. That was condemned. So the church justification is by grace, but man is also free. And I remember the night we were talking about that, I said that the whole thing is trying to keep a balance between grace and freedom. So it's justification by grace, but we are also free. Third point, if anyone shall say that by faith alone the impious or impious is justified, so as to mean that nothing else is required to cooperate in order under the obtaining the grace of justification, anathema saint. In other words, the church's position is, always was, and always has been, that it's grace, but that because we're free, we have to cooperate with grace. That's the Vatican, the Council of Trent's teaching on justification, which was the main issue at that period. Although, as I said, I don't think I'll say too much about that, but I'm trying to keep to the time. Basically, the church's position, the bishop talked about this, that scripture emerged from tradition. If you say that, church's position is that if you say scripture is the only source of revelation, then there are one or two things you have to explain. First of all, the scriptures weren't written immediately. There was a whole tradition which existed before the scriptures were written. And the scriptures were part of the tradition. As well as that, there were whole loads of books which nobody knew whether they were part of the canon of scripture or not. And it was the church over a period of 5 centuries, bit by bit, that defined what belonged to the scriptures and what didn't. So in that sense, the scriptures are also part of the tradition. And then, of course, the other great quote was from John 16, and we had it at Mass a week last on Sunday. Jesus says, there are many other things, but you're not ready for them now, and the Spirit of truth will reveal them to you. So we don't want to get into a great discussion about it, but there are all kinds of things which we believe as Christians which cannot be justified in the scriptures. Yes, General Assembly was arguing about it last week. One man stood up and said, all this stuff about allowing ministers to be married, and if a parish wants to take them, they can have them. There's a whole school which says you cannot do that because there's no justification in scripture for it. But the General Assembly is about to change it because dogma develops, and tradition is a vital part of that process in practice for us all. But anyway, we'll leave that. Reform of practice. The big need was for the Roman Curia and the papacy to be reformed. The Pope took that away from the Council because they didn't want it. And they still don't want it. Pope Francis is busily trying to do that very thing today, reform the Curia and the papacy itself. And he's receiving huge resistance. The bishops wanted to reform the bishops. There were many problems. The main problem was the bishops did not live in the diocese, and as well as that, they had loads of dioceses so that they could get loads of money. And the amazing thing about the Council of Trent was that the bishops themselves changed that. It reminds me very much of the transition in Spain from dictatorship to democracy, where the Franco Parliament, the Cortes, voted itself out of existence. It was an astonishing thing when it happened. And it meant that the whole process of moving from dictatorship to democracy was legal. It had all happened legally because they had voted themselves out of existence. And it's astonishing really that the bishops actually voted for things that involved huge changes for themselves. Right from the beginning, we've been hearing about the problem of the clergy. A whole load of things happened. Seminaries were set up. Clergy also had to live in their parishes, and there was limits to the amount of time you could spend out of the parish. But the main thing was the education of the clergy. There were other reforms as well, but we'll just leave it at that. Marriage, I won't go into that. Basically, the Council of Trent, it was the Council of Trent that the decision was made that certainly Catholics could only marry before a priest and witnesses, because prior to that in the Middle Ages, you didn't need any witnesses. I could just say to Muriel, I'll be your husband, Muriel, and you be my wife, and that was it. That was marriage. But it led to chaos. And so this doc amexi, which means even if, changed all that. I've tried to find out on the internet when this practice was adopted by society at large, because I can't imagine the whole world changing itself because of the Council of Trent, but I haven't been able to find that out. The legacy of the Council. It established order in the church and did a huge amount, it was a struggle, but a huge amount to deal with the problems that had led to the Reformation in the first place. A lot of that was done by law, and with the result that many of us have grown up, those of us who are Catholics, in a church which was very legalistic, very stuck on law, and that kind of comes from the Council of Trent. Division between the Church of Lutheran became permanent. There was no possibility of anything else. In general, both sides tended to go to the extremes. And the classic example of that is the balance or imbalance between word and sacrament. These are both part of the Christian tradition. The Reformers went in the direction of word, especially the Calvinists. The Lutherans had much more of sacrament, but basically they had this split between word and sacrament. I quoted him before, but I can only quote him because he was a Church of Scotland minister who taught scripture at New College, Alan Lewis, who was in my house once and sang at a meeting of ministers, and he said, I could never say this, but he can say it because he was a Protestant. He said, the Church of Scotland, no, but the Word was made flesh, and the Church of Scotland turned it back into Word again. You know, and that there's truth in that. And since in recent years, of course, both sides have been coming together in that. Lots of myths developed about the Council of Trent. A whole load of stuff that the Council of Trent is supposed to have said that they never said. But that happens to everybody. The Church, the Catholic element of it, took a kind of bunker mentality and really until the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the Second Vatican Council, it began to open out. But it took a bunker, it went into its bunker for a while, they came in flexible. The legacy of the Reformation, this is the last slide, so we'll get rid of that. I mean, you can argue all day about the legacy of the Reformation. One of the books quotes somebody who said that in history, everything causes everything. And I can understand what that means. The Reformation gets the credit for laying the foundations of the Enlightenment. But then again, you have to look, well, what laid the foundations of the Reformation? But that's one of the things that's said. Some would argue that it was the firmness in which the states of modern Europe took shape, with all the wars, the religious wars and so on. And if that's the case, then the Reformation would have to take some responsibility for the First World War and the Second World War and Napoleon and all the rest of it. So all of these things have been question marks after them. It's sometimes given the credit for capitalism, God help us. The Euro crisis, I mean, I'm just adding this notion that the southern Europeans, don't work and don't pay their taxes and all the rest of it, while people in Northern Europe keep all the roads. That's part of what's known as the Black Legend. There was a whole lot of propaganda about one against the other. When I went to Spain in 1963, I started to learn Spanish. One of the first things I understood was like a student who said to me, "Have you ever seen a Protestant?" To which my reply was, "Yeah, but they're a lot uglier than we are." But there's a whole thing there about Northern Europe and Southern Europe. Look at it, it's all around us just now. A lot of British suspicions about Europe at the moment have some roots in the Reformation. Because there's a whole part of the establishment in Britain that from the very start has considered the European Union a Catholic plot. It had Christian democratic roots, and all the original founders were Catholics. And the fact that it was called the Treaty of Rome didn't help matters. So all of that still floating around. Then there was the second Vatican Council, which was a huge step forward for the Catholic Church and the ecumenical movement. The ecumenical movement basically started in India in the 19th century, when people of different denominations started to see how absurd it was that they were each other's throats and they were all claiming to be Christians. And Scotland had a huge influence in the start of the ecumenical movement in the world in the Council of Churches. I read an article during the week by a fellow, his name Gumbel, that started the Alpha course. He said that he talked about modern developments, and he said Catholics and Protestants have stopped fighting with each other. The war is over. Well, all I can say to that is what my Spanish friend would say, Ojalá, oh to Allah that it were true. We've made huge progress, but there's lots of stuff still to be dealt with. And that's why the next meeting will be about ecumenism in Scotland at the end of June. So it's a bit longer than I thought, but that's all I can say to you in that short time. So for a few minutes, could you just chat to each other as we did the last time and see if there's any comments or questions that you want to raise for a wee while. So just talk to each other. Yes, it's encouraging people so much chat. So we have 25 minutes and then we'll definitely be here. No, the very latest is 9 o'clock, but if you've nothing to say, we'll be away long before then. But are there any comments or questions that you'd like to give? We don't want a big speech now here.
This is the fourth meeting I've attended. I was away at the last one, and I tried to chip in a couple of times, but nothing very much. I do want to try and say something that I think might be, it's important for me, and I don't know whether, I want to take more than 5 minutes.
Well, that's too long to be honest. I say seriously, we don't have time for 5 minutes.
Okay, we'll cut it back. When you talk about Council of Trent, it seems to me, I enjoyed the talk very much, but it seems to me that a big opportunity was missed.
You mean at the Council of Trent?
At the Council of Trent.
Undoubtedly.
Not tonight. At the Council of Trent. And the opportunity was there for our rapprochement. And there were Protestant contingents on their way.
Of course they were all invited.
Yeah. And in fact, there were conditions on their attendance, and they didn't find the conditions acceptable. So the thing fell apart, basically, the idea of rapprochement fell apart.
Well, most people would say that it had gone beyond that point before the Council of Trent. Yeah.
But anyway, maybe I had at that time. But what about today?
Yeah,
That's the question. And when we try to bring folk together through the ecumenism movement, we're talking about bringing Protestants and Catholics really together. But that's not what it's about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because there are plenty of other religions.
Yes. But that's why ecumenism is so important. That's why the people in India in the 19th century, they saw that. And it was as a result of that that the ecumenical movement started. And if we're going to be able to evangelize the modern world, we have to come together to do it. So, I mean, you're absolutely right on that. And it would have been great if it had happened at the Council of Trent. But
so, my question is, how are we going to give respect and equality of status to people of other religions who believe things that are different from the things that
Yes.
Christians believe.
That's
It's a
absolutely.
simple question. And my offer is that if next year you are setting up a study group of some kind,
Hopefully we
you
will.
take that forward,
Yes,
then I'm very happy to be here.
No, Anderson, I think that's a perfectly valid point, and one of the things we could do is bring people from different religions, Islam and others. We could do that. But we have a huge task to perform among the Christian churches as well. Anybody else? Any other points?
I would like to make the point that, I don't know about anybody else, but I think sometimes get overwhelmed by the political instability, the culture of divisions, and capitalism, and everything, just get bigger. But it happened there. You know, ordinary people must have been overwhelmed by all of this and looked to the church for guidance. And sometimes we don't get it because the church is trying to reform itself as well.
Yeah, I mean, there was a well-known Latin phrase which I'll test you again. Cuius regio eius religio, that's what it was said about the Council, about the Reformation. The vast majority of ordinary people didn't have much clue what was happening. Eius regio eius religio means whoever ruled, they followed his religion. You know, and people moved back and forward as rulers changed. And there's been lots of research, I think, done to show that that after the Reformation in England, for example, lots of Catholic stuff continued. People just didn't change like that overnight. You know, it was a very, very slow process, and there were lots of things that of the pre-Reformation church that people hung on to with great love in this time of the Reformation.
And so you said that you presented the council as doing two things, affirming doctrine and reforming practice. And it seems to me that it goes back to that church always in need of reformation, because that's precisely, I think, what Pope Francis is trying to do now.
Yes. I mean, those could be the aims of the church at any moment in history, I think. At any moment. David?
Can I ask a question for history, which is absolutely fascinating? What is the line between the Council of Trent and the Reformation and the religious persecutions on both sides, and ultimately the 30 Years' War, where I think 1 million people died in Germany, an argument about the king and so on, which only came to there and then with the Treaty of Westphalia, I think.
That's right.
Is there a line running from the Council to
I would have thought there were all kinds of lines crisscrossing each other. I mean, I don't really know, I couldn't give you a proper answer to that, David, except that it was because of that Charles V wanted a council, because as the Holy Roman Emperor, he didn't want all this stuff going on. It was causing upheaval all over Europe. And people were fighting against each other, and sometimes they were fighting on one side, and there were so many other issues involved. I mean, that stuff about the German princes, I mean, and the same happened in England, of course, with Henry VIII, and he saw his chance and grabbed all the monasteries and the riches that went with it and so on. I mean, it wasn't just a religious issue, it involved the whole society, because, to use a phrase that I used earlier, the tectonic plates in Europe were shifting, you know, and there were earthquakes and volcanoes going on everywhere, you know, as we were moving from the Middle Ages into the modern world. I don't know if that, I mean, does that satisfy you or not really, David?
Well, I'm just interested in how, if you made a point about the division was there now, there's no way back, and I'm just wondering whether ultimately that does lead to something like the 30 Years' War, where countries are going to war to enforce some their religions on countries which have a different society.
There was also another movement going on right up into modern times, which was, I referred to this also, that what we now see as the nation states of modern Europe are taking shape, you know. When we tend to think that they've always existed the way they are just now, but they didn't. That's why we get separatist movements starting to spring up again in some parts of Europe, you know, Spain, Italy, other places as well. Because there was a time when these nations didn't exist in their present form. I mean, Italy was only united, I think, in the 19th century. Because half of it was ruled by the Pope up to that point. It was in the middle of the 19th century the Church lost the Papal States and all that kind of stuff, with Garibaldi and all that kind of stuff, and Germany as well. And certainly Spain, that's certainly true in Spain as well.
Was Suleiman the Magnificent the one who caused the fall of Constantinople?
No. No, I'm not sure who it was, but it wasn't Suleiman the Magnificent.
Would that a spot of the Reformation?
Well, all these things had an effect. I mean, that was a shattering blow. I mean, all of that, I think, is so much tied up with what's going on today. It was in 1683, I think, that the Turks made another attempt at capturing Vienna and moving into Western Europe, and were finally defeated at that time. And that's why people in that part of the world see all these Muslims coming over the borders as another attempt at the same thing. It might seem strange to us, but you can kind of understand it from their standpoint, can't you? Because as I said earlier, the other side experiences the same thing when the Americans started bombing Iraq and Afghanistan and all this. To a lot of those people, that's the crusade starting all over again. So history, it seems a long time away, but it's in our psyche. And we're the same here with our attitude to the English and to England. A lot of that's rooted in the same kind of mythology. And I think it's important that we understand how much we need to open up our minds to, I've said this every time we met, to the truth, to be able to let go of our own prejudices. Hugh, for example, so sorry Hugh. One of your talks, one of your interventions at one of the previous meetings was about purgatory and so on. Remember you talked about that? Now, it's not that what you weren't saying, you were saying wasn't true, but it was a travesty of the truth. You were attributing to the Catholic Church things it doesn't believe and then attacking them. And we do that to each other all the time. Council of Trent did it to Luther because a lot of these people didn't really understand what Luther was saying. They thought they understood what Luther was saying, but sometimes they didn't. And we're all the same with each other. We'll get ideas in our heads about what the Church of Scotland believes or what the Catholic Church believes. And often we're wrong. And to achieve what Hugh's talking about, this getting back to union with other religions as well, we need to clean out our minds and actually sort out what's true and what's not true, and what is just myth. Because all these myths were deliberately created. I need to watch I'm launching it into another part of my life here. But for example, the Spanish Armada. The story we tell ourselves about the Spanish Armada has little to do with reality. But it was part of the Black legend. What we tell ourselves about the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition is a terrible thing, but it wasn't what we say it was. Because people deliberately distorted truths about each other and wrote pamphlets and all the rest of it, just exactly the same as the two sides are doing today about whether we stay in Europe or not. Nobody's interested in saying what actually was the truth. Everybody's pushing their own agenda. And that's been going on throughout history as well. And if we're going to make any sense of all this, we have to stop and say, right, enough. I need to find out more about this. Or be willing to let go of prejudices. Just the other day, can I just tell you, I said this to David, and I hope the person concerned isn't here, and if she is, I don't mean any offence, but on Saturday, I met two girls at the coffee morning who were here to buy a wedding dress in West Kilbride. And they had asked somebody in the street where they could get a cup of coffee, right? And a very nice lady, a wee dog, so explained. But what she said to them was, the Catholics are doing something up at the parish church. Now it might seem like nothing. You would have to hear the tone of voice that she used perhaps. But that phrase, the Catholics, I mean, what does that mean? Where does that come from? It's like, the Muslims, or the Rangers supporters, or the Celtic supporters. It's only a tiny little example, but it struck me at the time. I thought, God, you understand what I mean? Anything else that you want to comment on?
Yes, you were talking about development. You had just towards the end of the war, C.S. Lewis wrote his guide, Mere Christianity, where he got together with all the groups that he had in Oxford, and tried to sort of clear it. And we had the same thing happen. I was in Canada in '94, and the Anglican Church had a conference which was called Essentials '94, where they tried to get back to the core of what the Christian belief meant, because they realized there was a lot of things being added on by custom and practice. And I think this is the thing that's always trying to discover more and more what it is that God is asking of us and how we can respond.
Absolutely. I mean, that's about discernment. But one of the things that in the Catholic Church of the Second Vatican Council, one of the main aims, and this had been developing during the 20th century, was a return to the sources. Ressourcement, I think the French called it, because it was mostly French people that were engaged in that. And they were trying to get back to the beginning, go back to see what is the church actually all about. Now, of course, there are limits to that, because lots of things happen over the centuries, and you can't kind of go back to the beginning. But it was that desire to get back to the essence. There was a guy called Eugene Carson Blake, who was one of the first presidents of the World Council of Churches. And his answer to Hugh's question was this: how do we get to unity? And he said it wouldn't happen by conferences or meetings and negotiations. It would happen when each individual church rediscovered Christ. And when they all discovered Christ, they would discover they were one. And I think that's absolutely right. Does that make sense to you? Anything else? Is there anything you disagreed with, or no? You agreed with everything? Okay. Well, thanks very much for coming again. I hope you'll come the next time when Father Will McFadden will talk about ecumenism. As I've explained before, Alan Faulkner, the Church of Scotland, was supposed to join him, but he can't. Willie has a distinction in that last year, or the year before perhaps, he attended a meeting of the World Council of Churches in South Korea, representing Scotland. And that was an amazing thing, because the Catholic Church is not a member of the World Council of Churches. It cooperates with it, but it's not a member of it. And he was a Catholic priest appointed by the Commission in Scotland to represent not the Catholic Church, but the whole of the Scottish Church in South Korea. That was a huge step forward. And he'll be here next month to tell us all about that and other things as well. So thanks very much.